All right, I think we are going to jump in now. Hope everyone's having a good first Sunday of the year. Hopefully, everyone can hear me okay. So, we're going to jump in. Um, we received a lot of really great questions. So, rather than do what I had originally thought, I think what we'll do is really focus on those questions more than anything. Um, Before we get started with the questions part of it, I think it's important that we uh, lay some ground rules for that. One big one is those of you that know me well, you know that I'm more of a fan of good questions than good answers. So while I'm definitely going to give you my perspective on some things, I want to kind of make sure we're holding on to that loosely. I'm a firm believer that we only are able to grow and learn when we are willing to question the things that we think we already know. You know, like you can't learn something if you feel like you already know everything there is to know about that topic. So while we definitely have beliefs and opinions on these things, we're going to kind of hold on to those loosely. And I also want to make sure we're clear because some of these questions are sticky. Some of these questions are a little bit more difficult than others. That we also understand that the opinions are mine and mine alone. And if you don't agree with that, I don't think anything we're discussing this morning is a hill any of us want to die on. So there's definitely freedom for differences of opinions, especially on the things that were brought up. Also, want to make sure that you're aware that we can, if you have questions that aren't being addressed, or if as we're talking about some of these things, if you have questions that you want to probe deeper into, make sure you utilize that chat feature on YouTube. And we will try and circle back to some of those if there is time. And if there's not time, I'll find a way to touch base with you down the road a bit. So we're going to jump in. The first question that I received was really about the book of Job. The book of Job is a hard book for a lot of people to read. I know a lot of you have probably tried to read it in the past, and maybe you've had issues doing so. You haven't really known how to handle that book because it is kind of an odd book. There's a lot of different ways that the book of Job has been perceived throughout history. Some people hold it very literal, like it's a true story that happened in history. Some people hold it as more of a parable. I think both are fair game. You can look at it either way, really, honestly. Personally, I've always kind of held that to be more of a parable. The setting is very early on in Jewish history, so think the time of Abraham. So there really aren't formal Jews. This was kind of predating a lot of the things that we have in our Bible. If you get a chronological Bible, for example, you'll see that they place Job like in the middle of Genesis, really early on. I personally like to look at the book of Job as a whole and see this really remarkable story in the midst of suffering. So what Job is trying to do, he's combating a very prominent idea in the ancient world that when you do good things happen to you. When you do bad things, you are cursed. That's a common ancient belief. We, even today, if we're honest, we think the same way. I mean, we just had an election, right? If we vote the right way, good things happen. If we vote the wrong way, bad things happen. We have this cause and effect, this transactional view of the world and especially of God. Job challenges all of those preconceived ideas because the whole argument of Job is Job didn't do anything to deserve punishment, and yet bad things happen to him anyway. Unspeakable bad things happen to him anyway. And throughout, you have these conversations between Job and his best friends who are present with him in his grief, which is an amazing thing, but yet everything they say is wrong. So Job is tricky because the way we typically read the Bible, we pull verses and chapters and we just kind of say those things, and we kind of view all of the Bible on the same footing. So if it's in the Bible, it must be true. Well, if you do that with the book of Job, for like 48 or 38 chapters of the book of Job, you're going to be flat out wrong. and you're going to have terrible theology, right? So Job is a great case study just in the importance of context and reading things from start to finish and not trying to build our theology off of individual verses. Um, so when you read the book of Job, kind of put on that long view and try and view this as a whole. Also, it's important to kind of view the book of Job in the lens of what we see in the life of Jesus, who also echoes a lot of the same sentiments, right? Who sinned, this man or his father? Well, neither sinned, right? Bad things happen. It's just the course of life. So that's how I would encourage you to read the book of Job if you're going to dive into that. I know a lot of you, maybe you're doing chronological Bible studies this year. You're going to get there pretty quickly, so that could be a timely thing for you. Another question I received, and this one's a little sticky as well, the creation story. So Genesis 1 and 2, you got the creation story. For those of you maybe aren't as familiar with it, God creates the world in 6 days, rests on the seventh day. The question that has been argued throughout history is whether or not that is a literal 7 days or a figurative 7 days. Again, I'm going to reiterate the idea that you can hold either belief. I don't think either one is right. I mean, obviously there is a right answer. We can't know one way or another. Personally, I've always kind of viewed that more figuratively, and the reasons why have to do with the language used there in the Hebrew. It's written as a chiastic poem. I don't think we were supposed to take that literally because of just the way it was written. I also think it's important for us to kind of touch base on what we think the Bible does and what it is and kind of the point of what this book is about. We often, when it comes to the Bible, we want it to answer all of life's questions, and it doesn't do that necessarily. When they wrote the book of Genesis, I don't think the author was sitting there thinking, they're going to look at this and they're going to derive all of their science based off of this 2 chapters. The point of Genesis 1 and 2 isn't how the earth was created, it was who created, right? So the mechanics of how it all came together, I think, is a secondary thing that really we need to be embracing the idea that Yahweh, the God of the Jews, the God of all that is, they created the heavens and the earth and everything that lives on it. Like, that is the core emphasis of that. Arguing the semantics of how, I think, gets lost in the weeds. And I'm not sure it's really all that helpful in the long run. As long as we can agree that God created it all, I don't know why we need to have these arguments as to the small details. Okay, while we're doing a sticky topic, let's jump into a harder one. All right, so I was asked a question. And I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit for clarity. The question essentially comes down to, what do we do with passages like 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, and 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 15? And if you don't know those passages, which I kind of assume most of you don't have that memorized because it's a weird passage to have memorized, I'm going to read them for you real quick. 1 Corinthians 14, 34, 35 says, women should be silent during church meetings. It is not proper for them to speak. They should be submissive, as the law says. If they have any questions, they should ask their husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church meetings. 1 Timothy 2 says this, women should learn quietly and submissively. I do not let women teach men or have authority over them. Let them listen quietly. For God made Adam first, and afterward he made Eve. And it is not Adam who sinned, who was deceived by Satan. The woman was deceived, and sin was the result. The woman will be saved through childbearing, assuming they continue to live in faith, love, holiness, and modesty. So these are some difficult passages for us to read, especially because it's very contradictory to the way our culture operates today in a lot of ways. And throughout history, we've seen these passages um, used, I think, in very inappropriate ways, especially when it comes to holding down marginalized people throughout history. So, what do we do with these passages? Because Paul says what Paul says. The question we find ourselves asking um, is this something Paul meant to be lived out for all time? Or is this something that Paul wrote because he is a product of his day in time? And the larger question of how do we know which one it is, right? Because it's not clear. It's not like Paul puts a little asterisk at the end of it saying, hey, this is just for the first century. Future readers, you can, move on. So, what do we do with these types of passages? I think it's important to view them in their original context, which is hard for us because we don't live in that original context. We can forget very easily what it was like to live in the first century because none of us experienced what it was like to live in the first century. The first century world was not very favorable to women in general. Women were viewed more as possessions, more as second-rate citizens in a lot of ways. They were not able to learn. They were not able to do schooling. Their job were really to have kids, raise the kids, and keep quiet while the man ran the house. We mentioned a couple weeks ago in a sermon that men in the first century were viewed very much as minor kings of their little domains and their homes. That's the world in which Paul is writing in. Now, it's important to understand that what Paul says here is actually, in a weird way, very progressive for his time. For example, look at what it says in 1 Timothy 2:11. Women should learn quietly. The fact that Paul is inviting women to learn at all in the first century is one of those things where, especially a Roman audience that he's writing to in Ephesus, they would have like complete jaw drop that he would even be audacious enough to say that they can do that. Paul is inviting women into this learning process, right? So why should they be quiet, right? Men and women would have been segregated in the church services. So there was probably an issue where women not knowing what was going on because they're new to learning, like this is all brand new to them. Um, have you ever had a situation in your life where you're learning something and you're with somebody who knows what they're doing? You're asking questions all the time, right? That was happening during these services, right? Where these women were yelling out, asking questions of their spouse who was across the room. It was very disruptive. There's a chance, and like I said, we're guessing, but there's a chance that what Paul is talking about is really the core of what he's getting at is let's not be disruptive in services. If you have questions, we love questions. Let's wait till after, and you can ask those in a more appropriate manner. So what does it mean? He later goes on to talk about it in 1 Timothy, don't let women teach men. This is another one that's really kind of interesting. In the Jewish culture, men would become, or boys would rather be considered men at the age of 13. So we think men as 18 adults. Jewish culture would have had that a lot younger. A lot of times the way we practice these, not we, but 21st century people who want to take these passages literally. We let women teach kids, but not adults, right? Well, the problem is, we have women teaching kids 13 and older all the time, right? So are we living in disobedience to what Paul is saying here? That's an interesting question. So the question of like, how do we view this? Is this an all-time thing or a temporary thing? I think we need to look also into the way we see this practiced outside of Paul's writings. We see throughout the New Testament that women were viewed differently than what Paul is presenting them as here. Luke 8, we have a list of disciples. Women are viewed as disciples in Luke chapter 8. In Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, it's the women who stay at the cross with Jesus while all the men disciples flee in fear. A couple chapters later, when Jesus raises from the dead, it's not the men that he reveals himself to, it's the women. It's the women who actually educate the men that Jesus is not dead. In Acts chapter 1, we have all of the disciples hanging out in the upper room. There's women everywhere in that passage. Acts chapter 2, women are mentioned as giving prophecy. Acts chapter 16, we've got the beginning of the church in Philippi. Paul doesn't go to the men to start the church. He goes to a bunch of women out by a river. The church actually starts with a woman named Lydia. Acts 21, we've got the daughters of Philip who have a gift of prophecy, which there are no preachers the way we think of, like myself, in the New Testament. The closest thing we have is this prophecy, right? These people who are gifted with pointing people to the will of the Lord. Philip's daughters have that gift. So I don't know what you want to do with that. We got in Romans 16, we've got a bunch of women mentioned. We got Phoebe, who's mentioned as a deacon. We've got Priscilla, who's a laborer, a co-laborer in the gospel. She's also mentioned in Acts 18. In Romans 16, we've got Junia, who is mentioned also as an apostle, which means to be a sent one. We have case after case after case of women being put in leadership roles, teaching men. And I'm not trying to, sway you one way or another, but I think that that's something we need to wrestle with. What do we do with these types of passages? What do we do with the fact that Paul writes these things, yet the New Testament itself, Jesus in his ministry, don't really adhere to the same set? Those types of things personally lead me to question whether or not these were instructions by Paul for his day and his time. So that's kind of where I land on that. If you disagree with that, like I said, that's perfectly fine. There's no problem with that at all. But that's kind of where I sit on that. Hopefully that makes sense. If there's any questions on any of that, because I know that's kind of a deeper one, feel free to ask that in the comments. Hey, Vicky, groups are meeting. Do you mean church services? We meet every week at Kentwood Library, except for today, obviously. So feel free to join us at the Kentwood Library. Jeff, Galatians, neither bond nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female. Exactly right. So the point of that Galatians passage, and we're going to touch base on Galatians here in a little bit, briefly. The point of that Galatians passage is to say all of the things that would have separated are no more. One of the things you see throughout the book of Acts, throughout the New Testament, is this idea that the chief goal is to unify. So whatever causes divisions amongst you, get rid of those things. And that's really what Paul is trying to get at there, especially in this larger context that Paul is writing Galatians of Jews versus Gentiles. Christ is an equal opportunity for all people, regardless of backgrounds. Yeah, good. Another question I received this one in an email last night. My friends outside of church are Christians, but for some reason, they sadly do not attend any church services. Is there anything I can do to encourage them to come to church? I have tried, for example, to invite them to things like the church picnic, game nights, etc., to see if perhaps that could lead them to eventually trying out a church service. But I've tried, and this none of it has really worked. That's a huge question, and I don't think your friends are unique in that. I think, especially with the way American culture works, I think we have kind of this, even though we're kind of a post-Christian nation now, we still have a very deeply rooted, like, I'm an American and I'm a Christian, as kind of this intertwined idea. That's kind of how I was raised in some ways. You don't need to go to church, right? It's this personal thing. The biggest piece of advice I think I'd give you is to listen. I would really encourage you, rather than to always be on the offensive there, just to kind of take a break and listen to maybe why they aren't going to a church service. Is it because they were burned by the church in the past? Is it because they don't see value in it? Like, there's a lot of reasons why someone wouldn't go to church. It's really hard to engage them unless we have a working understanding as to why. And if it is, they don't see the value in it, I think your opportunity there is to not preach at them, but to communicate the value that you yourself have found in community. Because it's not about going and singing songs and hearing a sermon. Those things are things that we do at church services, but that's not why we go. I mean, that's not why I go, and I have to do a lot of those things, right? But we go because of the community and the impact and value we have in community. Um, so finding ways to kind of weave that aspect of your story into that relationship, I think that would be a really beneficial thing. Um, so often, I think in our country, we um, we view church service as like this to-do list thing. When everyone's super busy, if I'm your friend, I'm already busy. You're wanting to add another to-do to my list. I can understand kind of the pushback on that, but I don't mind adding to my to-do list if there's value there, right? So communicating that value is what I would recommend. All right, I got 3 more questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to jump into the comments with those, and we will uh, get through these. And then if there's time, we can go through a question that I kind of added myself as well. Question 5. President Trump will be adding a faith office to the White House that directly reports to him to protect and preserve the church. What are your thoughts? Yeah, we're going to try really hard not to get into the politics of this one. Regardless of who's in office, whether it be a Democrat or a Republican, the one thing I will say to this is whenever you mix politics and religion, or specifically whenever you mix politics and the Christian faith, it kind of always ends badly for the church. Um, while I respect what they're trying to do, I think their heart is in the right place. I'm not sure this is a good move for the church. And here's kind of why. We see throughout the New Testament, throughout Jesus' teachings, that the church will be persecuted, right? That's a common thread. We touched on it a little bit last week. When we normalize faith in this way, it makes it so that persecution doesn't happen and there's no stakes when it comes to being a follower of Jesus, which makes for very lazy and apathetic followers of Jesus. There's a reason why in countries like China, when Christianity became illegal, the church exploded because there was now cost, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace versus costly grace. This idea that grace is free, but it came at a great cost. When we can receive these things so easily, when it becomes so normalized, we can very easily forget the great cost part of it. So I get wary of these things. I'm kind of a weird counter cultural person in a way where I always I think any obstacle we have to following Jesus is actually for the church's benefit. Another thing I think is important to note here is often when we weave faith and politics in this way, whenever a political thing happens that people don't like, it's shed equally both on the political system and the church in the same way. And I don't think that helps us either, right? If we're called to reach the lost, be loving to our communities, I think we need to do that separate from politics. Um, Dallas Willard, in one of his books, he talks at length about we as the church need to stop relying on government and other social entities to carry on the mission of Jesus. The government's not going to do that. We as a church need to do that. This just kind of makes it murkier. And I would say that regardless of who is in office, like this isn't a Trump thing. This isn't, I don't care. Like none of that matters to me, right? So hopefully that kind of answers your question. Like I said, though, I do see, I think the intent there is good. I just think it comes from a kind of an uneducated basis where politicians think they're doing a favor when I don't think they are, but that's just me. You can have your own opinions on that one. Next one. How do you honor your wife as the weaker vessel in your household? Um, I'm assuming this question is kind of rooted in Ephesians 5, which is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands. That passage, husbands, love your wives. Kind of tied to what we talked about women in the church. Um, I I don't honor my wife as the weaker vessel because I don't consider my wife the weaker vessel. Um, when you look at what Paul writes in Ephesians 5, and there's other house codes like in Colossians that say very similar things, we get really caught up on the submit to your husband's part. In a lot of ways because it's been weaponized in the past. Um, Maybe not in our generation, but my guess is your grandparents' generation, this was kind of a weaponized passage. Stay in line, submit, do what I tell you to do. Kind of that leave it to beaver type of have my dinner ready when I get home. We forget that Paul doesn't just talk to the wives there, he also talks to the husbands. And what you find when you kind of dig behind the words in Ephesians 5, it's not a wife submit to your husbands, it's husbands and wives should submit to one another. If you're to love your wife as Christ loved the church, it means you're going to sacrifice everything for her, right? Which means your pride and your ego and your need to be right and always have control. You're going to have to sacrifice those things too. So it's a mutual submission. So the way Ro and I kind of do our house, we both have strengths and we both have the freedom to utilize the strengths that we have. Um, you know, I do my best to kind of keep an eye on the financial side of things, but the truth is, I would live in a dumpster if my wife wasn't here to make sure we had things like furniture and food and clothing. Um, she's way better at getting me to do things, to move and be more active. I could be very lazy, and so we don't really do the weaker vessel, stronger vessel thing. We both have equal say into the way things are run in our house, and we kind of submit to one another as much as we can. Um, that doesn't mean we don't argue. We probably even argued this morning, and who knows? Like it's just part of being married. But we try our hardest to kind of submit to one another as much as we can. So hopefully that answers what you were after with that one. The last question I have. So if there's more, make sure you comment, and we'll make sure to tackle those. If not, we'll probably just end this here. Well, I'll do one more question after this. The Bible says it prohibits sexual relations with a woman during her menstrual period. Is this still true? I expected questions about women's roles in the church and creation, all those things. This was a question I did not expect. So Leviticus, 3 different times, I can't remember the exact verses, it mentions that you're not supposed to be able to have sexual relations with a woman while she's on her period or right after childbirth. And the reason for that has to do with the way the Israelites viewed blood. Blood was considered, it kind of represented life. And to touch blood that was spilled in a non-ceremony type of thing, like a blood sacrifice, would make you ceremonial unclean. Same reason why you couldn't touch dead things. It made you ceremonial unclean. So that's kind of the core root of this passage. Don't touch blood because blood is bad. We don't touch it. Also, from like a kind of like a Darwinian survival of the fittest, preserve the human line perspective, blood carries with it diseases when you don't have antiseptics. Like it's kind of also a civic thing. You can't just have all of your Israelites die because they're living in filth and squalor and touching dead things with bacteria. And so that's kind of some of this. So the question is, like, do we still need to follow that today? This is where Galatians is really an important book. The book of Galatians, the core of it is, do we need to still follow these old religious laws of the Jews? This would be part of that. Do we need to still abstain from pork and all of these foods that we can't eat. Are we still supposed to honor the Sabbath? Are we still supposed to be circumcised? Are we still supposed to? All of these rules that you find in the book of Leviticus. And Paul is very adamant on no, you don't need to follow those because you are not a Jewish person. Jesus is the new covenant. In Jesus, we have freedom from the law. The law is death, all of these things. So the question that I want to kind of spin off of this and talk about is like, if that's the case here, what's the point of all of the rest, right? Like, what do we do with the Old Testament? Do we just need to completely scrub all of it? We can just disregard every single thing it says in the Old Testament. Like, what's the point of it? What do we do with the Old Testament? What do we do with things like the Ten Commandments? Does that mean we don't need to honor our mothers? What do we do with all of that? And I think that is the larger question. And here's kind of the thing I have always kind of held to. When it comes to the Old Testament laws, I try to look to see what Jesus himself taught. Jesus teaches through the Ten Commandments, right? You see that in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus teaches the Shema, honor the Lord your God above all else, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like, those are Old Testament laws that Jesus himself followed. Jesus in himself kind of, in a sense, followed the Sabbath, but he spun it his own way, right? The Sabbath is, it's not this pious, strict thing. It's for our benefit. It's a gift from the Lord. So that's kind of how I've always told the difference. I don't see Jesus teaching this aspect of Leviticus, for example, and I definitely see Paul speaking against it. So that's kind of where I would draw that line. The rest of the Old Testament, I think, is an important aspect of just understanding this grand story that God is weaving with Jesus as the focal point. You see Jesus throughout the Old Testament in different ways. And it's such an amazing and beautiful story of God's resilience and love for his people as they constantly make mistakes, and how he's constantly there for them time and time again. And it all kind of culminates and reaches this climax with Jesus, the Messiah, coming to earth, living amongst us and loving people. Like, that is really what it's all about. So that's kind of how I would encourage you to kind of take that Old Testament. So let's do one more thing real quick. One of the questions I get asked a lot during this time of year especially is, like, how do we get more out of reading our Bibles? I don't know about you, but there are definitely times where reading the Bible is, that to-do list, checklist type thing. I do it because I'm expected to do it. So what I'll do is I'll take my Bible and I'll open it up, and hopefully it won't be upside down, and I'll read the words. It takes me about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and then I go on my merry way, and my day is over, right? So often I think we kind of do that. So the question is, like, how do we get more out of that time? How do we make it so that reading the Bible is not just a guilty to-do thing, but rather a life-giving relationship building between me and the Lord? How do I get more out of reading the Bible? Another way to kind of look at it, instead of reading it passively, how do I actively read Scripture? I think there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Some people like to study the Bible. Some people are more devotionally readers. They kind of they're more focused on, like, how does this make me feel in that aspect of things. I think both are great. I think it's a misconception where we lean too heavily in one end or the spectrum or the other. Like, we need to always be studying. We need commentaries and Bible dictionaries, and we need to have, outlines and all of these things. That's the only way I can read the Bible. Or the complete opposite of, I'm only going to read it and feel good. Like, we need to find a balance there. Personally, I'm kind of lucky in that I get to study it every week, right? So when it comes to my daily reading, I do more of that devotional approach. If you're trying to find that balance, my encouragement would be to, as you're reading it devotionally, ask yourself questions, write the questions down, and use those to kind of guide your study times later on. I don't think you need to be doing deep study every day. I don't even think you need to be doing it every week. Do what makes sense for your life. Um, but what I like to do as I read the Bible is um, I like to engage it in a way where I'm asking questions as I'm reading it, and more importantly, especially if it's like the Gospels, I like to place myself in those scenes as much as I possibly can. So, like in Mark chapter 5, Mark chapter 5 is one of my favorite passages in Mark. Mark chapter 5, you have Jesus. He just gets done calming the storm, and he ends up on the other side in this place called the Gerasenes. And it's while he's there that he meets this demon-possessed man who has got all these evil spirits, who is living in the tombs, who was kind of shunned from um, his community, his village. And what I want to do this morning is I want to read through this passage and kind of show you a way you can engage in these types of texts. And my hope is you can kind of learn and grow from this. So let's read it. Let's do Mark chapter 5, verse 1. So they being Jesus and the disciples, they arrived to the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out of the tombs to meet him. I'm going to pause there because I already have a question built into my head here, right? The disciples just saw Jesus calm the storm. They literally just said, "Who is this man? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Have you ever been in like a turbulent situation and you finally get to the other end and you finally get, like, in this case, your feet on dry land, and there's this sense of finally we made it, like I'm never stepping foot in a boat again, and then are immediately greeted by this demon-possessed man who comes running out of the tomb? How do you think the disciples, as they are witnessing all of this, feel? Like if I were to have my journal open right now, I would journal a little bit about kind of the feelings that I would feel about what it would be like to be the disciples, right? And I'm only 2 verses in. Verse 3, this man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered around the burial caves and the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. Again, I find myself putting myself in the stage of just, what does it feel like to be the people in the village who watch this, who hear this, who this is just reality for them? The fear of knowing that you can't even stop this guy. Verse 6, when Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. With shrieks, he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In the name of God, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already said to the spirit, "Come out of this man, you evil spirit." And then Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" And the man replied, "My name is Legion, because there were many of us inside this man." Then the evil spirits begged him again and again to send him into some distant place, to not send them into some distant place. Can you imagine like being the disciples here and just kind of hearing all of this legion of demons? Like you've seen Jesus drive out demons. Like this is more than you've ever seen before. Like this is a very ghastly and violent and kind of like out of The Exorcist type of thing, right? Like it's just a nightmare in flesh. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. "Send us into those pigs," the spirits begged. "Let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the entire herd of 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. The herdsmen fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran, and people rushed out to see what had happened. Can you imagine what it'd be like to be the herdsman? It's your job to protect these pigs. This guy just killed 2,000 of your livelihood. Like that's money out of your pocket. I'd be kind of upset, even if he got rid of the demons, right? Like I'd still be kind of upset. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw that the man had been possessed by a legion of demons. He was sitting there, fully clothed, perfectly sane. And then I love this next verse because the response to all of this is to be afraid. Can you wrap your mind around what it would be like to be afraid of seeing God's power? God did this remarkable thing. How powerful is Jesus? Then those who had seen what happened told the others about the demon possessed man and the pigs, and the crowd began pleading with Jesus to go away and leave them alone. Just go away. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon possessed begged to go with him, but Jesus said, "No. Go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been." So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of the region and began to proclaim the great things that Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed at what he told them. So as I wrap that story up, what I find myself thinking about is this man has been given this opportunity in this story. And rather than follow Jesus the way he wants to follow Jesus, because I mean, if I were delivered by delivered from 10,000, all of these thousands of demons, and Jesus was the one who did it, like I would want to just take the shackles that I was breaking and like put one around my leg and one around Jesus' leg and say, "I'm never going to leave your side ever again." Like that's my response as well, right? I never want to be in a place where you are not. But Jesus says, "No, I need you to go and tell this story of what God has done for you." And here's, if I were journaling, and maybe I will afterwards, I don't know. If I were to journal, I would be asking myself, what has the Lord done for me? What is the story that God has blessed me with? What has God delivered me from? What has God done in my life? And I would write that story out because that's the story we have this opportunity and this amazing chance to share with the world. So that's kind of what I think it looks like to actively engage in the text. And I'm hoping you kind of notice some of the subtle differences, right? It still only took us a few minutes to read. Obviously, if we were journaling, it would take quite a bit longer. But you're not just reading it word for word and moving on to the next word as fast as you can, right? You're letting these kind of ideas, these scenarios, these moments sink in. And we're asking ourselves different questions as we kind of read through this text. So as we kind of start the new year, that would be my encouragement as you maybe make a goal for yourself to read more deeply than you did the year before. Try and enter this text as much as you can. A couple other tips I kind of have if you're trying to get into the Bible and you've kind of always struggled, change up your translations. We with you every Sunday morning, we always read out of the NLT. I read out of it this morning. Feel free to kind of explore different versions. There's more word for word translations. There's more thought for thought. There are paraphrase Bibles. If you're reading devotionally, like we just did this morning, like the Message, it's not a good translation. You're not going to be getting, super accurate Greek out of the Message, but it is a really great devotional Bible, especially with what Eugene Peterson, the author of it, what he does with the Psalms. Beautiful stuff. Like this year personally, I've kind of made a goal for myself. In my devotional time, I'm only reading the Gospels all year long. I'm just going to kind of go over and over each time a different translation and kind of begin to notice the subtleties and the differences. It's okay to just read one book over and over for, as long as you need to. Personally, read the Bible in the year plans. I hate them. I think that they do more harm than good. And the reason I say that is if we are already conditioned to view Bible reading as a checklist type thing, having a literal checklist. And I know we just did like the entire New Testament in 6 months. That was a little different because it was smaller chunks. Reading the Bible in a year, you're doing 5-6 chapters a day. For a lot of people, that's just too much. So stay clear of that if you can. Start small, and try those different translations. Those are kind of the big tips I would give if I were to begin to venture into Scripture, or maybe the first time in a while. That's kind of how I would engage that. So with that, I don't think there are any more questions. If I missed something, please let me know. I really appreciate all of you. I'm excited to be back in person next week when we get back into Kentwood Library and continue. I think we're going to be doing a new series starting next week. Don't quote me on this, but I think we're going to go maybe 6 weeks in Philippians. I've got a couple things I want to check before I cement into that, but I think that's where we're going to start going starting next week. So look forward to connecting with you then. In the meantime, stay warm because it is not outside. I'm grateful that I could sleep in, wear a sweatshirt, and drink coffee in my warm house. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing y'all next time we meet. Bye.